Before I begin my prepared presentation, there's been some names mentioned today that I want to comment on. First is my friend Punchy Jr. I had the wonderful opportunity of interviewing Punchy Powell that the plane is named for. I interviewed him at his home and in his little museum that he had, and got an interview there. And later I got him. I know that Punchy was interviewed a lot, but I don't think anybody else got what I got. I got him reading from his logbook. So I've got a couple of Punchies. Then Major John Lucky Luckadoo. I just interviewed him at Memorial Day down at the 8th Air Force, but I had met him previously when he was there being interviewed by Spielberg for Masters of the Air. And he signed my autograph book then, but I didn't get a chance to interview him, so I got him Memorial Day with a really nice interview. My program today consists of a couple of people that I never got to interview, and then a couple more interesting folks that I wanted to share with you. On the night of June 5, 1944, across the western half of England, 15 Army Air Corps officers fired a green flare into the night sky. In doing so, initiated Operation Neptune, which was the air assault component of the D-Day invasion. One of those officers was my father, Lieutenant L.J. Turner. And from his base at Greenham Common, England, he then proceeded to send out 94 aircraft comprised of units of the 82nd and 101st Airborne and glider infantry. But first, he was a music man. Had an undergraduate degree in music before the war, a master's degree after the war, and became the first director of music at Bethel College in Tennessee. He then continued in graduate school and was one class away from a doctorate in music. When, for the sake of his growing family, he took a civil service job at what was then Camp Gordon, Georgia. And he continued to be musically involved after that time. So it is not surprising that in his first letter back to his new wife, he would write, "I think they have classified me a bandsman. But I have been convinced that the armed services have very good systems and methods of classifying personnel." And they took a look at his tests and records and education, and they found a very bright brain, and they stamped it top secret, radar. It's when radar was just coming into use. So Dad found himself and his radar group on the top of a mountain at the end of Southern California, right next to the Mexican border. And they were just learning about what it could do and how it worked and how to operate it. They didn't know, they were just learning. So they noticed that every day, about the same time, they were getting blips. And they couldn't identify what they were, and they couldn't identify exactly where they were. So they kept watching, and they kept showing up about the same time each day. And I am sure that one day, someone was out there with binoculars and searching to find the blips. They had to be somewhere. And sure enough, over on the Mexican side of the border, it turns out that they were there defending America against a Mexican train that was rolling around each day. Well, then Dad gets sent to England as an air control officer. His base was Greenham Common, 60 miles southwest of London, in a group of 5 that were clustered there together. And I remember as a boy, Dad telling me and my younger brother about interesting and unusual events that happened at Greenham. I remember a couple of them. One was the morning that they could not open the field because this half was in bright sunshine and clear air, while this half was in dense English fog covering parts of all the runways, and it stayed there all day. They couldn't open. The second one is that one day, although they were 60 miles from London, they heard a German V-1 buzz bomb puttering through the air until it stopped. And then instead of puttering, I think there was puckering until it hit the ground, some not close to them, some distance away. And the last one is that although they were an American air base, British planes would land there if they had engine trouble, if they were short on fuel, if they'd been shot up, whatever. And sure enough, one day a British fighter pilot crash landed on the field, and the word got back to the tower that when he was removed from the plane, his exact words were, "Blimey, what a place to get hit." And he had been hit in the buttocks. This is a picture of the base at Greenham. I know you can't see it that well, but it's there, and I've got another one that shows the field covered in white striped airplanes right before D-Day. This one does not. All right, then came D-Day. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the famous picture of Eisenhower on the field surrounded by airborne troops. I have that picture but couldn't find it either. Dad told us as boys of seeing Eisenhower on the field. That picture was made at Greenham because I have learned since that Greenham was the only base that Eisenhower visited on June 5. He also recorded his Eyes of the World speech there that day. And with Dad in the control tower, Dad had the duty on the afternoon of June 5 through the morning of June 6. With him in the tower that day was British Air Marshal Tedder. So, Dad passed away before I began my interviewing, but due to the foresight of our mother, he left his handwritten memories of D-Day, which I will share with you now. I was one of 3 air traffic control officers, we were called flying control officers, in the control tower at Greenham Common Airfield near Newbury, England. Toward the end of the day, there was much more activity. Members of the 82nd Airborne Division and the 101st Airborne Division were assembled on the airfield in front of the control tower, and General Eisenhower was there with them. A high-ranking officer from the RAF, that was Marshal Tedder, was in the control tower with us. I'm out of order. Around 11 o'clock at night, the call came through to the control tower requesting permission to take off. We started out 94 C-47s at that time. Some of them were towing gliders, and the rest were loaded with paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st. The next day, while we were waiting for our planes to return, an English plane crash-landed on our field and came to rest in the intersection of our two longest runways, blocking both of them. A few minutes later, the call we had been waiting for came, requesting landing instructions and informing us that they had wounded aboard. We had no other choice than to bring them in on our short runway. Fortunately, all landed successfully. We three flying control officers took turns every third day. As the duty officer, it happened that D-Day fell on my turn as a duty officer. So I was the one who spent the long, anxious night at the control tower, wondering how things were going. On that historic day, everyone had a job to do, and I'm certain that Dad did his well. Here we go. I thought I had not brought something, but I have. Now, the next fellow, I never got to interview Dad, of course. Next fellow is Ernie Latham, my buddy Ernie Latham. He was the father of a couple of fellows that I did business with out around Fort Worth, Texas. And I never was with Ernie, but maybe 3 or 4 times. But the last time I was with him, he took me out to Cattleman's Steakhouse in Old Fort Worth for the best steak I ever had. And when we finished up, he wanted to go outside and find a stand of the old Fort Worth stockyard fencing. And I have a picture of Ernie standing there against the fence, and he's got his arm up on the flat top rail. And it's so appropriate because Ernie's first job was to walk on that flat rail in the old stockyard surrounded by longhorns and thousands of beef cattle, and open and close the gates and move them from pen to pen. And I have this image in my mind of Ernie in his blue jean coveralls and a checkered shirt and his boots on and about a 10-gallon straw hat, because Ernie did that job when he was 5 years old. And when Ernie started school in the first grade, there was a bully. And the bully found him every afternoon and beat him up. And gradually, Ernie learned to fend for himself a bit and learned to fight a bit, and he kept taking a beating for quite a while until he could finally, one day, fend off the bully and send him on his way. And that was the day that Ernie's father stopped paying the bully a nickel a week to teach Ernie how to fight fend for himself, and get Fort Worth, Texas tough. He made it. Now, Ernie went into the war as a B-24 pilot. And I don't actually remember the full details, but about his 8th mission, I think, he was flying out of Italy. He had to ditch in the Adriatic Sea. And I have only heard of 3 B-24 ditchings. Y'all know how deadly B-24s were in the water. I've only heard of 3 with more survivors than Ernie's 6. Now, I was told this by one of his sons, and it is in his obituary, which I have, that surviving that ditching and having flown missions, Ernie was offered a free pass to go home and no more war. But he told them that he didn't want to go home, he wanted to fly fighters. So they took him to a nearby P-38 base, and he took one orientation flight in a P-38. And of course, as any fighter pilot would do, he went back and buzzed the bomber base. Well, unknown to him, somebody took his picture doing that, and they sent it to him some 30 years or so after the war. Again, I know you can't see all the detail in the picture, but there are 3 prominent things. There's a tree, a tent, and Ernie's P-38 down on the deck. There's also a story about him rooster tailing a wheat field that day, but I don't have a picture of it. So Ernie went on to fly 50 missions. I believe it was the 429th Fighter Squadron, Hangman 19. My buddy Ernie. Now my next guy has a most unusual historic place in the 8th Air Force. His name, come on Phil, his name is Bill Thorns. And Bill was a top turret engineer in Fertile Myrtle. And he was in the lead plane with General Curtis LeMay in the right seat. Lead group, lead division on the first Schweinfurt raid, Regensburg and Schweinfurt. And their group was Regensburg. They went to Regensburg. Of course, you would all know what a disaster that raid was, and they took losses going to Schweinfurt, the other side, but the Regensburg side didn't take much punishment. They wound up landing in North Africa. They reloaded, they bombed Italy on the way back to England, and there wasn't much to say about that. He's got some good stories about what happened, like nobody knew the password to land in North Africa, not LeMay or anybody. So that was that one. But he was also in the same place, in the same plane, leading the whole, I think it was a couple of thousand bombers to Schweinfurt 2. And when I speak to other groups, they don't know that Schweinfurt 2 was known as Black Thursday, or why. So I explained that the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17s and 600 men. And there's a monument on the grounds at the 8th Air Force that denotes every group that flew, including the bombardier buddy that I had, the 388th Bomb Group. Well, Bill sent me a copy, a transcript of his entire diary, and he was very generous. I copied it and sent it back to him. I think it was his wife's. But I called him up and asked him, would you please send me your handwritten copy of Black Thursday? And he responded by saying, well, I left my diary at the museum in England. He said, I'll see what I can do. 2 or 3 days later, this appeared in my email. And I would like to share it with you now. October 14, 43. I only had an hour of rest, and at 4:30 a.m. we were briefed on a mission to Schweinfurt, Germany, to a ball bearing factory that puts out half of Germany's ball bearing output. We had much flak over the target and very much fighter opposition. This is the first time we got a good view of their rocket firing fighters. Not very accurate. We led this formation. Coming back, we were hit very bad by flak. It killed our group navigator, wounded the bombardier, and group commander Colonel Oles was in the right seat. It also knocked out number 2 and 3 engines. We had to fall out of formation to 12,500. Fighters then attacked us but didn't do any damage, and we finally lost them in the clouds. This all happened on the way back around Reims, France. We finally hit French coast and then the channel. Across the channel we had to throw everything out that would lighten the ship as we lost altitude fast. We threw guns, ammunition, extra radio equipment and supplies. We were forced to land on an RAF field near the coast called Gravesend, England. I mentioned it killed the group navigator. They had 2 navigators on board because they were the lead ship. Lifting the navigator from the plane was the worst sight I ever hoped to see. We stayed overnight and the ship came down and took us back to base. We completely destroyed the target but lost 60 planes. This was my 18th mission. Group claimed 11 fighters, took 7 losses, 70 MIA, and 7 wounded in action. Bill Thorns, a very unique place in 8th Air Force history. Got one more picture to show you. Proud to have it. It's Phil and Pancho. Interviewed Pancho, met Pancho at Myrtle Beach, South Carolina at a veterans thing. That's him in his plane in the picture behind. Pancho. His group commander could not pronounce his name. His last name was Pasqualicchio, so he became Pancho. And Pancho was a 40-year fighter pilot. He started flying P-40s in World War II, flew Phantoms in Nam, and more. The one thing to remember about Pancho, there is always one more thing with Pancho. You think you've reached the end? Not with him. Now, Pancho was such a good aerial gunner that they kept him here to teach gunnery. And in a competition, he outshot one of the astronauts. I think it was John Glenn. I don't remember for sure. But he was in charge of teaching the new pilots how to shoot down aircraft. And he was like the top dog that was around. So each morning he would go do a weather check flight. And this morning when he came back and parked his plane, sitting right next to him was a brand new P-51. I believe he was flying 40s. And they had brought in this P-51 to boost morale and show these young pilots what they had to look forward to in this beautiful new aircraft. Well, Pancho, got out of his plane and went and climbed in the P-51. He wanted to see the instrumentation and he wanted to just see what it felt like, and he said it smelled like a brand new car. Had something like 5 hours of flying time on it. Well, he's sitting there and the ground crew chief comes walking by and he says, "Lieutenant, if you don't get this plane in the air, you're going to really foul up the schedule." Well, of course, the problem was that Pancho was not on the schedule. But he asked, he said, "Well, is she ready to go?" Chief said, "Yep." He fired her up. Taxied her out. At this point, I need to tell you about a conversation that I overheard between two P-51 pilots who were both in the Georgia Aviation Hall of Fame. And I was in the car with them. And they were talking about how many first-time P-51 takeoffs they had seen take off the ground, roll over, and die because of that big Merlin engine and that four-bladed prop and all the torque. If you didn't set everything right, they saw a bunch of them die. Well, Pancho got him up off the ground without any trouble because he was a real deal. And he flew around for a while, and then he decided to come back, and he called the tower and said, "I want a gear check." They said, "Okay." Well, next thing Pancho said in the interview was, "The Mustang red lines at 505. I came in at 504. And we're right by the tower." And they're hollering at him, screaming at him. We couldn't see it. "You came in too fast." He said, "I'll do it again." Which he did. Well, then he came in and landed. And as you would know, every commander, his group commander, the station commander, and probably every commander they could find was standing there waiting to chew on him when he got in. And Pancho simply said, "I just stood there with a dumb grin on my face because I just got to fly a new P-51. Well, there's got to be punishment for Pancho for doing that. So they decided the right thing to do was, instead of teaching them how to shoot, he would go down to where they were towing the targets. And he was going to tow targets now. So he goes down there, and what he finds is that the people towing targets are 6 lovely young women air service pilots. And his concluding remark was simply, "I had a really good month down there." Then along comes Korea, and Pancho goes over there. And one of the memorable things that he talked about was how one of his missions was to bomb a runway, a railway tunnel, and in order to do that, you had to get down right on the railroad tracks and run your bombs into the tunnel, and then pull up real steep, which he did. But he was down so low that he got hit by ground fire, and up under the P-51, that's where it's vulnerable, and it knocked out his cooling. He was able to fly it for a while, but had to crash land in a rice paddy. And his comment about that was simply that, "Oh, all I got out of that was a fractured skull." Well, it came to pass that on a very memorable mission, he was flying cover for a downed aircraft waiting for the rescue helicopter. And he's keeping the enemy at bay, and the first helicopter comes in and it crashes, and it's down too. And there were multiple people on the ground. It wasn't just a single fighter that was down. So he keeps the enemy away, and the second helicopter comes in and gets them out. Well, his family lived in Washington, D.C. with the unusual name Pasqualicchio, and it made the papers in Washington about his mission. So it so happened that Pancho's father was working directly with Truman on Italian-American relations after World War II. So Truman sees the name in the paper, he says it's got to be his boy. Sends out the message, "I want to see him when he comes home." So Pancho gets home, and he gets summoned to the White House. And he said, "I was never as scared in combat." And he is ushered in to the Oval Office, where he said, "I saluted the Commander-in-Chief," and he rose from the desk and greeted me like my grandfather and said, "Son, tell me about that mission." So he got a one-on-one with Truman in the Oval Office. At the end of his interview, he said, "I flew for 4 different Air Forces. I flew for the Army Air Corps, the Air Force, the Vietnamese Air Force, and when I was in Europe, I knew some guys in the Luftwaffe. So I just flew with them for about 6 months till the commander in Europe found out about it." Pancho Pasqualicchio, another real deal. Brent, thanks for having me, buddy. And I have incredibly historic film and voice of these people. The most historically significant are people like Dutch Van Kirk that I interviewed. I don't remember if that was mentioned. I got an interview with Van Kirk at his home in Stone Mountain. I've interviewed Holocaust survivors, and one of them, I interviewed him the day after he came back from, he was at both Auschwitz and Dachau. I think it was Auschwitz, the 70th year anniversary of their liberation. He was the main speaker for that. And I interviewed him the day after, and he was with the 101st Airborne. And I asked him, I tried to figure out, why are you down here with the 101st? He was Polish. His family was killed in the Warsaw Ghetto. And he commenced to tell the story in the interview, which is such a remarkable story, I won't try to tell it all. But when he was first taken into Auschwitz, not long after he arrived, they came through the barracks and asked, who can sing? And he had been trained from young childhood to sing classical arias. So he became a singer, and it kept him alive. And the number on his blouse was so low that the SS didn't bother him, because they thought he had to have a connection high enough to keep him alive for that long. Well, he's on a train where they're going to build underground facilities for aircraft, and it's the young men that can handle the heavy work. They get strafed, he gets off the train, and he's hiding. One morning he hears the sound of heavy equipment, heavy vehicles moving down the highway. And he is familiar with the Red Star of the Russians, he's familiar with German insignia. This stuff has a white star on it, and he doesn't know what it is. But he decides to take a chance. And he goes out into the middle of the highway and stands there and waves down the whole 101st Division. It's moving. And the guy he gives a wonderful description in the interview of the guy from South Carolina trying to talk to this Polish kid who speaks 4 languages fluidly: Hebrew, Polish, German, and whatnot. Well, they finally communicate. The bottom line to the story is that they adopt him as an interpreter, and they put him in the uniform of the 101st Airborne, and I've seen his picture in it with a Tommy gun over his shoulder. Those kinds of experiences I have, so many others, like Brentwood. I have half a dozen Pearl Harbor survivors eyes on. Sea, land, air, I probably got about half of that 100 is air battle stuff. D-Day, Bastogne, prisoners of war, code breakers, Rosie's, and of course, at the end, Hiroshima with Van Kirk, and I think I am probably the only person to ever interview both the last surviving crew member of the Enola Gay and the last surviving person who was in the room and saw the Germans sign the surrender in Reims, France. Now, I'm about to end, but this is my plan. I have finally found a production company that is going to help me put all of that into a full, from Pearl Harbor to the dropping of the bomb. I hope for it to be about 2.5 hours, between 2 and 2.5 hours, and put it all together for me out of my stuff. It has been a life-enhancing experience for me to meet these guys, like Mr. Jones, who I forgot to mention earlier. I've interviewed Bob. It's been a wonderful life-enhancing experience for me to have met these guys and gals and get to do these things.